My name is Jessica Caldwell. I am 34 years old, and I work as an architect who restores historic buildings. The last morning I waited for Brandon, Sinclair began outside the county marriage office, with our paperwork across my lap. It was the third time we had scheduled the ceremony. By late afternoon, I knew he was not coming. Brandon had texted before 9 saying a client crisis had come up and he would be there as soon as possible. I watched couples arrive, sign their papers, and leave together while the hours passed. Near closing time, the clerk came over and asked if I wanted to keep waiting. I looked at my phone once again. There were no new messages. The first time Brandon missed our appointment, he blamed an emergency presentation for an investor. The second time, he said one of his development sites had failed an inspection. I had accepted both explanations because I loved him, and because I had become good at making his priorities sound reasonable. This time, I closed the folder and stood up. I thanked the clerk and walked outside alone. I did not cry in the parking lot. I did not call Brandon or ask where he was. Instead, I drove to my office, where an acceptance form had been sitting in my desk for weeks. My company had offered me the chance to lead the restoration of an old waterfront district in another state. I had planned to refuse because Brandon had already told me he would never move. My supervisor looked surprised when I placed the signed form in front of him. He reminded me that the project would begin soon and would change my life. I told him I understood. For years, I had treated Brandon's preferences like decisions we had made together. That afternoon, I finally made one without him. When I stepped outside, nothing around me looked different. The same traffic moved past, and my phone was still silent. But I no longer felt like I was waiting for Brandon to choose me. The day he failed to show up became the first day I chose myself. The next morning, Brandon acted as if nothing important had happened. He apologized for missing the appointment and said the client situation had become impossible to leave. Then he asked what I wanted for dinner, as though changing the subject could erase an entire day. I answered every question calmly because I had already stopped expecting different answers from him. 2 days later, one of my coworkers asked if I had seen a local business magazine online. She sounded hesitant before sending me the link. The article featured a charity event for a downtown redevelopment project. In the middle of the photo gallery, Brandon stood beside Madison Pierce with an easy smile on his face. He had once told me he disliked public events because they were a waste of time. I kept scrolling through the pictures instead of closing them. Madison was signing copies of her new book while Brandon stayed beside her in nearly every photograph. My mind drifted back to my first architecture exhibition a year earlier. Brandon had skipped that evening because he said crowded rooms made him uncomfortable. Suddenly, memories that had never seemed connected began fitting together. I did not ask Brandon about the pictures when he came home. Instead, I started looking around the apartment with different eyes. The shelves held books I had bought. The kitchen was organized the way I preferred. And every bill had always been paid because I remembered every deadline. I quietly packed a few things into storage boxes after he went to sleep. He never noticed anything missing. Over the next week, I handled the paperwork for my transfer and confirmed my start date with the new office. At home, I removed another small piece of my life every evening. A framed photograph disappeared one night. A favorite coffee mug disappeared the next. Brandon walked through the apartment exactly as he always had. He never asked where anything had gone because he never realized how much of our home existed only because I had built it. The hardest part was not realizing Brandon had feelings for someone else. It was realizing how long I had accepted being the safe choice instead of the first choice. One evening, he asked me to send him a project file from the computer in our study because he was still at work. While searching through his folders, I noticed a document with Madison's name and opened it without thinking. It was not a love letter or a dramatic confession. It was a collection of notes Brandon had saved over several years while preparing proposals and presentations with her. Between the business plans were short personal thoughts that had never been meant for anyone else to read. He wrote that Madison understood the version of him he wished he could become. He also wrote that I made life stable and predictable when everything else felt uncertain. I read those lines more than once because they explained everything I had been trying not to understand. Brandon had never planned to leave me until he was certain about his future. I was not standing beside the life he wanted. I was simply making that life easier while he figured out whether someone else would return to him. That truth hurt more than any affair ever could, because it reached far beyond a single mistake. I closed the document, sent the project file he had requested, and turned off the computer. When Brandon came home later that night, he thanked me for helping him without asking how my transfer paperwork was going. I answered with the same quiet voice I had been using for days. The countdown inside me continued, even though he had no idea it had already begun. A week later, I attended the first planning meeting for the waterfront restoration project. That was where I met Owen Crawford, the executive leading the preservation partnership. Instead of asking whether relocating would be difficult because of my relationship, he asked what kind of architect I hoped people would remember 10 years from now. I answered without hesitation because no one had asked me that question in a very long time. For the first time in years, I left a meeting thinking about my future instead of wondering how someone else would fit into it. I left before Brandon realized I was truly gone. By the time he returned to the apartment, most of my belongings had already been shipped to my new city. I left behind only the furniture we had chosen together and the keys on the kitchen counter. There was no long letter waiting for him because I had already spent years explaining feelings he never stopped to hear. The new project demanded everything I had. Every morning began with site inspections, planning meetings, and long walks through blocks of aging buildings that were finally getting a second chance. I rented a small apartment close to the waterfront and filled it slowly instead of trying to recreate my old life. At the end of each day, I was tired from work instead of waiting for someone to text me back. A month after arriving, our restoration team partnered with a neighborhood community center that served local families. That was where I met Emma, an 8-year-old girl who spent most afternoons drawing old buildings with surprising detail. She quietly asked if the empty brick warehouse across the street would ever become beautiful again. I smiled and told her that sometimes old places only needed someone willing to believe they were worth saving. I started seeing Emma whenever our team visited the center. She always carried a sketchbook and proudly showed me every new drawing before anyone else. Owen was often there reviewing funding plans with the community directors, but he never interrupted those conversations. He simply waited until Emma finished talking before asking if I was ready for the next meeting. Weeks passed, and my life settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar because it was peaceful. No one expected me to cancel plans at the last minute. No one made me feel guilty for caring about my work. Every decision belonged to me again. And every morning I woke up thinking about the buildings I wanted to restore instead of wondering whether Brandon would finally choose me. Jessica and I continued crossing paths through the community center over the next several months. Emma greeted me every visit as if we had known each other for years, and leaving her behind became harder each time. One afternoon, a social worker quietly explained that Emma had spent too much of her childhood moving from one temporary home to another. That conversation stayed with me long after I drove home. I began asking what it would take to become a permanent guardian. The answer was encouraging but complicated. My work required unexpected travel, long construction days, and emergency site visits that could not always be postponed. The agency explained that a stable support system mattered just as much as a caring heart. I understood why, even though hearing it left me disappointed. A few weeks later, Owen asked if I had time to talk after one of our planning meetings. We sat in a quiet conference room overlooking the waterfront while the rest of the team headed home. He said he knew about my conversations with the agency because the community center had requested additional funding for Emma's long-term care program. Then he made a proposal I never expected to hear. He believed there might be a practical way for both of us to help Emma build a permanent home. Owen explained that he was willing to enter a legal marriage built on responsibility instead of romance. We would maintain separate finances, equal rights, and complete freedom to end the agreement in the future. The only purpose would be creating the stable household the agency required before approving a permanent placement for Emma. He looked directly at me and said he would never expect affection in return for his help. I did not answer that afternoon. Instead, I hired my own attorney to review every page of the agreement without any connection to Owen or his foundation. We discussed every clause until I understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it did not mean. Nothing guaranteed a family. Nothing promised love. It simply created a legal structure where Emma could finally have the stability she deserved. Several days later, I signed the agreement because I trusted the process more than emotion. Owen signed beside me without asking for anything beyond what we had already discussed. We left the courthouse quietly and drove to the community center together. Emma ran toward us with another drawing in her hands, smiling before she knew anything had changed. At that moment, none of us realized that the decision we made for her future would slowly change all of ours. 3 years later, our restoration project brought me back to the city I had once been so desperate to leave. Emma was thriving, and Owen and I had built a quiet life that no longer felt temporary. My work filled my days, and my evenings belonged to the family we had created together. I had stopped wondering what Brandon was doing a long time ago. I saw him for the first time after a planning meeting downtown. He recognized me immediately and hurried across the lobby before I reached the exit. He looked older than I remembered, and there was a hesitation in his voice that had never been there before. He asked if we could talk for a few minutes because he had been hoping for another chance to explain everything. I listened without interrupting while he admitted his marriage to Madison had fallen apart. He said losing me had forced him to realize how much of his life I had quietly carried without asking for recognition. Then he told me he thought about me almost every day after I left. I looked at him calmly and said that understanding my value years later did not erase the years when he chose not to see it. Brandon asked if we could start over because we both knew each other better than anyone else. I told him we no longer knew the same people. The woman standing in front of him was not the one who had waited outside a marriage office 3 times hoping love would eventually become a priority. He lowered his eyes, but I had already said everything that needed to be said. A few days later, our foundation hosted a public fundraising event for several community restoration projects. Madison unexpectedly appeared with documents connected to the legal agreement Owen and I had signed years earlier. She believed revealing how our marriage had started would damage my reputation and everything we had built. Instead of stopping her, I quietly waited while she stepped toward the stage, convinced she had found the one secret that could finally destroy us. When I looked across the ballroom, Owen was already watching me. He did not step forward to rescue me or speak on my behalf. He simply trusted me to tell my own story, just as he always had. At that moment, I realized the man who had once made me wait was now the one left waiting for an answer that would never come. While the man beside me had spent years proving that real love never demanded waiting at all. Madison finished speaking and lowered the microphone with quiet confidence. The room remained still as every eye turned toward me. I walked to the stage without rushing and accepted the microphone from the host. I looked around the ballroom before speaking because there was nothing left that I wanted to hide. I told everyone that Madison was correct about one thing. Owen and I had entered a legal marriage for practical reasons, and we had never hidden that from the people responsible for Emma's future. Every legal review had been completed honestly, and every decision had followed the same standards required of every family. What mattered was not how our household began, but how we chose to build it every single day. Then I explained something no document could ever describe. Owen had never asked me to become someone different in order to deserve his support. He never used kindness to create obligation, and he never reminded me what he had done for Emma or for me. He simply kept showing up, day after day, until trust quietly became part of our lives. He gave me the freedom to choose instead of asking me to repay a debt. Brandon stepped forward as if he still believed there was something left to recover. He said that if our marriage had not started with love, maybe there was still time for me to reconsider everything. I looked at him for a moment before answering that he had misunderstood the story from the beginning. He thought I left because I found someone better. The truth was that I left because I finally found myself. I turned toward Madison and thanked her for revealing the agreement because I no longer felt ashamed of it. Our family had not been created by a perfect beginning. It had been built through ordinary choices repeated every day with honesty, patience, and respect. Then I walked down from the stage, reached for Owen's hand first, and realized that the strongest part of my life was never the way it started. It was the people who stayed after every reason to leave had already passed. A few months later, Emma asked if we could spend a quiet weekend by the ocean before school started again. Owen packed sandwiches. I brought a blanket. And Emma filled a small bucket with shells she insisted were too beautiful to leave behind. We stayed until the sun began to disappear over the water, saying very little because none of us needed to fill the silence. For the first time in years, peace felt completely natural instead of unfamiliar. As I watched Emma run along the shoreline, I thought about the woman I used to be. I believed love meant waiting long enough for someone to finally choose me. I believed that if I became easier, quieter, and more patient, I would eventually become impossible to lose. Instead, I learned that real love never asks you to earn a place that should have been yours from the beginning. Looking at Owen beside me, I realized our family had never been built on dramatic promises. It had been built one ordinary day at a time through honesty, respect, and decisions that matched actions. He never asked me to wait while he figured out what I meant to him. He simply showed up every day until trust became something we no longer had to question. I never heard from Brandon again, and I stopped wondering how his story ended. Mine had already moved forward without needing an apology or another conversation. The greatest change in my life was not finding someone new. It was finally becoming the person who refused to leave her future in someone else's hands. I was no longer the woman who stood still, hoping someone would come back. If my story feels familiar, I hope you remember one thing. Never confuse waiting with love or sacrifice with self-worth. The right people will not ask you to disappear so they can decide whether you matter. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear it today. I would also love to read your thoughts in the comments. Tell me the moment in this story that stayed with you the longest, because your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear.